Welcome to this panel. My name is Tamer. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. And I'm pleased to present to you our speakers for the next panel, which is wearable technology from the practice field to prime time. This panel is part of a sports science track, which is presented by Catapult. Our first speaker is Mary Wise, who's the head volleyball coach at the University of Florida. We also have Steve Holmes, General Manager of Smart Devices team at Intel. We have Andrew Hawkins, Cleveland Browns wide receiver. We have Adir Schiffman, Executive Chairman of Catapult. And we have Daniel Chow, Founder and CEO of Halo Neuroscience. Our moderator is Abe Madkour. He's Executive Editor of Sports Business Journal. This panel is 1 hour long. We have 45 minutes for the panelists, and we have 15 minutes for Q&A. If you want to post any questions, please go to our app and select Twitter, #WearableTech, and compose a tweet. This is how we get the questions, and then we will give them to the moderator. Having that said, I'll pass it to Abe. Thank you.
Thank you. How about I give it up for Tamir? He did a great job. First year. Way to roll. Welcome, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. It's been a really jam-packed day. This is your session, so even though he broke it down as 45 and 15, we'll go to your questions as soon as you ask them. So it's your panel. Ask the questions. We will get to them. The session title is Wearables from Practice Field to Prime Time. In our space, we have seen an unbelievable amount of tension, investment, and just interest in the wearable space. He mentioned everybody. We got Mary from a world-renowned program at the University of Florida. Steve at Intel's doing some amazing stuff. Give it up for this guy. He goes to school at Columbia on Thursday, practices in Tampa in the offseason, wide receiver from the Cleveland Browns. Who remembers him from 4th and Long? Great story here with Andrew. Adir with, I think, one of the hottest companies in the space, Catapult. And Daniel with, I think, with all due respect, one of the newer players in the space with Halo. They've been at it 3 years, but really a year or so into sports. So they're making some interesting things. I'm going to ask each panelist to just take a minute and give the audience a little bit of your role in the wearable technology space, and then we'll jump off into a lot of areas. Daniel, let's start with you.
Yeah, so Halo Neuroscience is probably very different from just about any wearable that's here at this conference. We specifically do not sense anything. We do not collect any data. We're actually delivering energy to the body. So specifically an amount of neurostimulation that's focused on the motor cortex, this part of the brain that's responsible for movement, to help the athlete gain neurologically from athletic training.
Great, Adir. How many are wearing a wearable technology device right now to track anything? Raise your hand. Okay, I just wanted to get that. Thanks.
It's definitely not a Catapult device because we're not in consumer yet, but
right.
You should, I don't know, as soon as we do, you should buy one of those. I mean, we're from Catapult, so the way we see the world is that practice and game day are a continuum, and it is about delivering wearables and an analytics platform that improves player welfare and player performance down at the practice level, helps teams make good tactical decisions, and then delivers data for broadcast and for fan engagement. And in fact, we think that everybody should be involved in that ecosystem. So that should be broadcasters, it should be leagues, it should be teams, it should definitely be players. I mean, we work with Hawk and we have long discussions about the importance of players having a role in all of this as well. And the ideal outcome is that fans and get a better experience through broadcasters, and that players play longer and play better, and the game is better for everyone. So that's how we see the world.
And briefly, Catapult is a chip or a system.
That's right. So we've got a wearable that I've got show and tell. So I'm going to surprise you with a new little wearable a little bit later on. But yeah, I'll show you what our new wearable looks like. That's
Great.
Right.
Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any own any wearable companies to talk to you guys about. I guess my position is basically, we wear the Catapult at the Cleveland Browns, and basically just giving you my perspective as far as how it affects player performance, player safety, and kind of how we feel about wearables and where we are as far as, adopting it in its life cycle. And it's very early on, and it's all new information, and we'll get into that a little more.
Steve Holmes. Yeah, I mean, at Intel, really, we think about Intel's role in technology, and it's really has been largely about bringing more and more performance in a smaller and smaller package and at a lower price to the world. This technology is really most meaningful when it's creating experiences, and there's not many experiences that people care about more than sport. I think everybody participates in it from when they're a child to watching it as a fan as we get older. And I think at Intel we know that the technology can enhance the experience of the individual athlete, of trainers and coaches, and all the way up to the fan and the broadcast experience. And so that's why we think that with Intel technology we can actually do a lot through partners to create value and a better experience for people.
And coach-wise, with the volleyball program, Wearables, how have you seen them interact with your program?
What's a volleyball coach doing up here? A few years ago, for those of you who follow men's basketball, if you remember a few years ago, there was a basketball player from the University of Louisville who had that tragic injury in the middle of the March Madness. We had a player with that same injury before the tibia fractured. And she was on a jump count. We had to limit the number of jumps that was done with the student trainer keeping tabs every time she jumped in practice, because the trainers told us, the doctors, she can play on the weekends, but she can only jump 40 times in a week. And we saw how it wasn't very effective. And it was right after that season, that was her junior season, first team All-American, going into her senior season that we became aware of the VERT product, the jump measuring and device, as used in a Bluetooth, just a little piece that the players roll into the top of their spandex. And we're able to measure the number of jumps and how high they jump. And for the female sports aspect, anything we can do to engage the TV audience. And what the typical fan doesn't realize is how high the top players in women's volleyball jump. We have one that jumps over 11.3. That's 11 feet, 3 inches. Who averages over 30 inches every day in practice, but the regular fan wouldn't know that. So the engagement, what we can do in our matches on the Jumbotron, what we've engaged, adding it to the SEC network, and in our own practice every day, number of jumps, how high they jump. So from a injury prevention to a marketing, it's been pretty exciting what VERT has done for women's volleyball.
And so how much are you using that? We can use this as a jumping off, but in your coaching decision making?
We use it every day in practice, and the players wear it in matches. And I'm looking at it in terms of having an idea of our front row players, how often they jump, how many jumps they're doing a day, and we can begin to see when they've maxed out. We get diminishing returns. So our trainer's holding the iPad every day, and she and I are talking. So we use it just in terms of adjusting drills. But I don't think we've scratched the surface on what it can do in terms of fan engagement in the arena and on television.
Have you found yourself over-relying on data?
No, I think it just is telling me what I thought, only now I've got objective feedback. I can tell you if a kid can jump. Now I can tell you how high.
Great. Let's talk other specifics that, Coach Wise pointed a couple there that she's using it for the entire panel. Other specifics, and Andrew, you could talk about where it was used in practice for you, for the audience to get a little bit more.
Well, yeah, I guess along the same lines is, what we did at the Cleveland Browns, and Cleveland has kind of been on the forefront in football as far as using the wearables. They've been early adopters, and our head trainer, Joe Sheehan, and our director of high performance, Adam Beard, who I'm sure is in here somewhere, but they do an incredible job of kind of keeping the data in real time and using it on the field. So we had a player who had hamstring issues, and they essentially put him on a pitch count. And what that did was it limited his reps, and it prevented him from pulling his hamstring. He had 3 or 4 seasons previously where he would miss a large amount of games due to the weak hamstrings. Well, this way we were able to monitor, how much work we were putting on the hamstrings and keep it down so he was able to play through all 16 with no hamstring issues. Also, from a performance standpoint, if we can get the same amount of work done more efficiently, that's the goal, because then what it does is it creates a larger life cycle for the athlete later on, so you're not overworking. We would go into games, and, I would have a conversation with Adam about how on game day, my legs feel the worst that they feel all week. And he was like, that is terrible, right? Now, anybody could figure that out. Well, now we have the data to back that up. Okay, this is what you need to do. You need to scale back this day, and that way every week the athlete is peaking on Sunday, not only helping us, as far as our value is concerned, but also giving the fan a better experience as far as watching the game.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like, I'm just a blunt Aussie, okay, so bear with me on this. But basically, I don't understand how soft tissue injuries are acceptable in elite sport. We should be focused on trying to wipe out soft tissue injuries. If I'm a league, leagues often ask me questions like, what do you think the most beneficial application of this technology is commercially? The most beneficial application is having the best players playing during the games, because that drives up viewership and that delivers the best outcomes. And if I'm a league, actually, I don't want these players finding it acceptable to get soft tissue injuries either. So, those are great stories. And really, I think the focus of all of this starts with player welfare and trying to maximise the health and safety and welfare of the player. That results in improved performance, so your legs aren't tired on game day. You're going to play better. Your season is going to be longer. Your career is going to be longer. And that's good for the whole, again, I say the whole ecosystem. It all starts from player welfare and builds out from there.
What do you think?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. From a neuroscience perspective, one of the things that we hope to bring to athletes and trainers is that if you're training towards something in a given amount of time, like, what if we can make that training more efficient? Like, what if we could help that athlete acquire the skill and the explosiveness neurologically faster and train that part of the brain so that you could hit your goals and you can move on to the next thing that you want to train on? Or if you finish ahead of schedule and you have time to recover a little bit, extra recovery time is always good for the athlete. So yeah, to the extent that we can keep our top players playing, because we fall in love with these guys. We want to see them play. We want to see them play, have nice long careers, and to the extent that we can use technologies to stretch that, that's awesome.
I do think that there's a big opportunity around that personalization of training as well, because I think one of the challenges that normally you just say, all right, everybody run 100 laps. But 100 laps may be perfect for one person and actually push somebody else to the point where they are going to be spending the next 3 days recovering. Being able to understand when an athlete stops benefiting from the training and when they need specific training is, I think, one of the values that wearables can provide and that this data can provide.
And so to get to specifics on this, Andrew and Coach, the players, you said that the devices on your players were on their side. Andrew, yours was between where, your shoulder pads or?
Shoulder, it's in the shoulder pads, and on days without the shoulder pads, it's in our undershirt and between the shoulder blades.
And just for the audience, any resistance at all to having your performance tracked by these wearables?
Absolutely. I don't know if.
We haven't seen it. It's a contest to see who jumps the most number of times in a practice and the highest. So there hasn't been any pushback. I think one of the things that they love about the Vert is how simple it is and how small it is. Like a key fob, and they just roll it in their spandex and have no issues.
But you
we had the same dynamic as well, where guys are, they're trying to race to see who has the fastest miles per hour. But for slow guys, they're not going to want that tracked, right? And that's what happens. Unfortunately, as you get older, you get slower. So at 30 years old, I'm not going to be able to keep up with a 22-year-old Travis Benjamin who's running 22 miles an hour fresh out of bed without stretching, right? So, there's two sides of it. One, it'll help elongate your career. If the average career is 3 years, right? And the wearables can help you get to 6. But there's some people who are going to play, who would usually play 10, that may also only get to 6 because we have these guys who are testing out better than you, that are faster than you, and it's a life cycle. So it's going to help some guys, hurt some guys, and I think that's where you're going to see the resistance once you get to the evaluation side, and if it's helping make those decisions as far as how far your career goes, that's where the the resistance is going to come from.
But if a guy after 6 years is slowing down on the data, it's a lot more than just the basic sensor outputs. It's player load and things like that. But he's slowing down on the sensor. But on game day, he's still scoring TDs. No one's cutting that guy because of his data that he's slowed down, right? So in the end, it's still on-field performance that is going to be the guiding decision by these coaches.
You think so?
Yeah, that is definitely. We work with 800 or 900 teams around the world. It's a lot of teams.
Right.
We see the way these teams use the technology. The poor applications of the technology is when a coach walks in and says, I'm going to use this to make sure to keep my players honest, right? To make sure that they're not slacking off, and that's the worst application of the technology. But the best applications is when they take players and they look at the career of these players and how they can maximize their performance over their careers. And certainly if a player is performing on field or on court, we've not seen any evidence of that player being cut because of dropping performance scores. The opposite. We see examples of coaching staff trying to improve the performance of those players because they are performing well on field, and we want to maintain that performance on field for as long as possible.
Well, I think there's two sides. I guess it's different for every sport. I've as a football player, we've seen players that have played incredible in the field and have still gotten cut. Guys that are slowing down. I think our sport specifically is sometimes they try to get out at the right time, right? And they don't time it up well all the time. So they might cut a guy too early. He goes somewhere else and has another 5 years of incredible football. Well, but that's just how the sport is. Anquan Bolden, he got released after helping win a Super Bowl. He goes somewhere else, and he's still Anquan Bolden. He was never a 4-3 guy in the first place. But I think what the data does for guys that, I go into the GM's office. He says, you're slowing down. I say, no, I'm not. That's how it's been for the last 60 years. You're not as fast as you used to be. Yes, I am. Well, now you have the paper, right? And you can pull up the data and you can say, no, you're slowing down. And look, well, what am I going to say then? I think that's where the resistance comes from. And like you said, if that's what they're making the decisions off of, cutting people, then you're right. It's wrong. It's the wrong way to use the wearables because it doesn't measure, heart. It doesn't measure leadership qualities. It doesn't measure what kind of, guy you are on game day as far as motivating other players and yourself and rising above whatever your physical limitations are. Like I said, my feet are dangling on the chair right now. So if you were to go solely off of numbers, I probably wouldn't be a guy that would benefit from that. But like you said, I can benefit from it from making me a better player as far as everything else is concerned. Training better, getting the most out of my performance every Sunday by applying the wearables and the data throughout the week.
So guys that are cutting players using this data, we should be chatting to those teams about how to better use this data because that is the wrong way to use the data, and you'll be happy to know we don't measure height with our wearable. So,
Thank God.
That's something important about all of this data, right? Or not just sports data, but data in general. Like, we should never take data in isolation. Like, it should always be contextualized with common sense, with other points of more human evaluation that are more subjective. Like, data should be complementary.
And so for you, Steve, Adir, you guys have been in this game for a long time. There was resistance probably early on to many of the technologies that you were developing and out taking to the market. But here in 2016, it's far different, right?
Yeah, so not to brag about this, but last year when we were on this stage, Catapult, it's a public company in Australia. It was a $50 or $60 million business. Today it's a $300 million business. That pretty much tracks the trajectory of the uptake of this technology. We think globally the elite market using wearables, we've got most of it. Maybe it's 7, 8, 9% penetrated. We think in the next 3 to 5 years it's difficult to see any elite team anywhere around the world not using this technology because, when coaches like Jimbo Fisher at FSU come out and say things like it dropped our soft tissue injuries by 83%, when Steve Kerr make comments about its contribution to Golden State's performance, then we see huge uptake. It seems to me that this will be ubiquitous in 3 to 5 years.
Last one, you're at what percent? 7 to 8%?
I think that globally we're under 10%. Under 10% of elite teams globally are using a technology that in Australia, parts of Europe, and increasingly in the US, is being proven to be completely effective.
And Europe and Australia were ahead of the US in this space.
Yeah, Australia went early because we don't have much money, so we've got to find tricks to make players perform better and last longer. Right? We've only got 25 million people. But
I do think that the protection of the data, who has access to it, how we treat it is really critical. And then the tools that we have, right? It's very easy to draw the wrong conclusions from data without actually looking at on-field performance, really taking it as a holistic picture, because in the end you want to get the best performance out of every athlete and give them the best long-term health outcome that you possibly can. I do think that the idea of bringing data then to the fan experience is really interesting as well, because the success of fantasy football, the fascination with statistics and stats, I think these are things where you can enhance most any fan experience if you actually have the right data. And it has to be something that's the fan can relate to. But if you have that information, it can really enhance that experience.
What's an example of something that, sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. An example is at the X Games, where we were able to show on the snowboarding competitions, how far the athletes went through the air, how many times they rotated, how high they went, how hard they hit the ground. And actually seeing, how hard they were hitting the ground was a really powerful metric, because you started to understand that, whether they hit the ground with 10 Gs or 20 Gs, it really affected the appearance of the landing. Sometimes it affected the actual outcome of the landing, where the board would break or they would actually end up falling down if the level of impact was too high. And you could start to sort of conceptualize exactly what these athletes are doing and the amazing amount of performance that they're actually bringing to this event.
Got some great questions here from the audience, so these are all jump balls to anybody who wants to comment on them. How long before we see wearable tech expand across the high school level?
1 year ago.
Where in Australia and Europe, or
It's happening here at a pretty rapid rate as well. I mean, again, so coming from Australia, it was hard enough to get my head around college sports in this country. You go to a Texas high school game, I mean, what is happening there, right? So, I mean, there's like 70,000 people in a football stadium. So definitely we've seen uptake starting to accelerate at the high school market here in the US.
how many clients does Catapult have in the high
So
school?
it would be under 24 clients relative to the 800 or 900 at the elite level, but it's expanding pretty rapidly.
And those are deals with the high school federation or a specific high school?
Specific high schools, but again, I thought every high school in Texas was going to approach us first. Actually, there's no rhyme or reason really to the way that high schools are taking this up. It's a really mixed bag, but frankly, the first thing they say is Catapult. Aren't you just for NCAA D1s and pro? But when they realise that there's applications for this down at the high school level, we think that the next 12 months there'll be a lot of take up by high schools in the US.
Coach, does that?
All sorts of high schools around the country, players are using the vert, but also so is our Olympic team, because it allows our Olympic coaches, when the players aren't in Anaheim training, they are overseas playing. And by using the data that they can see anywhere in the world at real time, some of our best players are on jump counts with their pro teams, and that the coaches can follow that. So, the thing about women's athletics is so much of the research has been done on men, not on women. How many years ago, 50 plus years ago, Little League figured out the pitch count. How many is too many for a 12-year-old? And we've got girls right now, volleyball, and I don't mean to make this the volleyball ad, but there are more girls playing volleyball. It's the #1 team sport in the country. We've passed basketball. So you have all these girls, these young girls playing volleyball, and no one knows what's too many jumps. What's too many swings on a weekend where they play all day Friday in these qualifiers, all day Friday, Saturday, and Sunday? We don't have any data, because it's the studies, mainly on men and even fewer on the sport of volleyball. So getting high school girls wearing the vert is really, really good.
Yeah, I think importantly, the cost of the technology is coming down dramatically. So there's really no reason why you can't deploy it at a high school level. And I think most parents, they want their kids to have the best sports experience, but also the best academic experience and the best long-term health outcomes. So, I think the trick is really getting a lot of the sports science to catch up with the data that we can provide, right? Because if you don't know how many jumps is the right number of jumps, then it doesn't really matter what the number is. Just like heart rate has long been a sort of mystery for a lot of people. They don't know if they're, very healthy or about to, have a cardiac arrest, because that number doesn't mean anything without the context that comes with it.
That's a good point. A couple questions here, so let me get to this. How do we get past data for data's sake and get real, meaningful, contextual feedback for consumers and athletes? So it's kind of to the point that you're hitting on there. Mm-hmm. Where do we, is it more in storytelling or more in display?
Well, I think that's the truth. The truth is on this for fan engagement. No one cares about the data. I'll tell you, people think they want to see the maximum speed that a player runs. That's a little bit interesting for a little amount of time. But actually, the purpose of this data is to create stories that engage the fans and more deeply immerse them in the story of the sport and the emotion of the sport than they've been able to do without this data. So I think that's absolutely correct, and in some ways it's the same story at high school. The challenge at high school is not the hardware, it's not the tech, it's exactly what everyone here has been saying. It is simplifying it so that it's appropriate for high school athletes to be able to understand and respond to, because if we pump the same data to high school that we pump to the Browns, where you've got half a dozen team members focused on strength and conditioning performance, they're just not going to be able to use that data. So, it's all about appropriateness of the story for that individual.
Yeah, I mean, this is a Basis watch, which is a product that is shipped by a company owned by Intel. But one of the things that's most useful about it is that it does a really good job monitoring your sleep. And just monitoring your sleep is only so useful if you know that you had a bad night's sleep. What's really important is then giving you recommendations about how do you get a good night's sleep. And I think that's the challenge, is having all this data is great, and even sort of knowing what you did or what your performance was is interesting, but actually knowing what you should do next, what does the data actually mean? That next level of analytics is, I think, where a lot of the effort has to go, and is going now. I mean, I think people now see that without that next level of sophistication around tying all the data together and drawing meaningful conclusions around it, you're really just filling up.
And so to your example, Steve, if I wore that and had a terrible night's sleep, that would tell me what?
Well, I mean, I think the trick is that there are certain things that can contribute to a poor night's sleep. And actually, in this case of this particular product, it actually gives you recommendations about habits that you can adopt that will improve your sleep. And so in this case, it's making specific recommendations. I think the more data you have, the richer the context you have in that data, actually, then you can start to draw connections that you might not draw otherwise, like every time I watch the news before I go to bed, I have a bad night's sleep, and so maybe that's what's disturbing me. You can't really get that from biometric data. You start to have to know a lot more about what's going on with the person, but I think as you start to collect a lot more of this information and have the tools to tie it together, you can start to make really meaningful improvements.
Question here, it says for Andrew, and I'm going to say the Coach Wise is probably, but anyone can jump in. As a player, what kind of wearable tech would you want to come out, and why? What kind of wearable tech would you like to come in?
That's a good question.
And as a coach, is there a piece of wearable tech that you would like to see?
Yeah, we talked about it with the Vert guys, that we need them to invent something that players could wear on a wrist to measure ball speed. Why has softball captured the ESPN audience? Part of it is the speed of the pitch. And we use the gun, the radar gun, in practice for measuring the speed of the serve, but the ball has to be traveling right towards it. It's not very effective. So I'm hoping they'll create something players can wear on their wrist so we can measure. They're hitting 55 to 65 miles an hour. The men, obviously, they hit harder. But that people can relate to that. That's a ball coming at you at 65 miles an hour, and oh yeah, you're only 10 feet away. And so I can't wait till they create that.
Andrew?
I would like to see, there's a couple of things. One is concussions. I mean, that's an issue in football. Football has obviously been my life. It is an issue for the NFL and football as a whole, and it's something that I think we all want to see resolved. And I feel like, and I've read about companies that are working on, wearables that help, track the impact of hits and things like that. So I would like to see something to come out that could definitively help, reduce the amount of concussions that we're seeing in football. And also, and this could very well already be in the works, but, something on the football that says when you get a first down and a touchdown. Yeah. You know what I mean?
I'm with you on that.
That seems...
Why is that so hard to figure out?
I feel like that should have been the first thing we did, right?
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, so...
I'm with you. I want to follow up, though, because I'm going to ask each of you that question. Is there a piece of wearable tech? But there's another couple of good questions from the audience about using expanding wearable techs in terms of concussion prevention and treatment technology. So to follow up on Andrew's point, what is being done out there in that space?
I mean, our tech spends, a lot of our tech is about measuring, identifying tackles. So, fortunately, there's no single sensor that just says that was a tackle. So you have to be a bit smart in building algorithms to identify tackles. So certainly, which it's nice for us, right? So certainly certainly we identify tackles across a whole lot of football codes around the world, and then we can start quantifying what happened in that tackle. So what were the velocities of the different players going in? What was their deceleration event, their lateral movement, their G-forces? How much of an impact did that have on them as an individual? How does that impact something called player load, which you'd be very familiar with? So certainly we do a lot of work around impact as it is. Concussion is not just a problem in the NFL. It is certainly something that all invasion sports are dealing with, a lot of football codes around the world. And I think there's a lot of companies working on that. The attitude that a number of other leagues around the world have taken to concussion, which is slightly tangential, is, how do we look at the flow of the game to try and identify which scenarios most create the risk of a concussion event occurring, and change the dynamics slightly to try and avoid some of those scenarios. And again, in Australia, where our technology, I said I'd show you a technology. So this is what Andrew currently wears. And so
that's what
he's wearing at the moment, which is pretty small, except, so I said we needed a single platform for player welfare all the way through to media in game. So this is like the new technology. That's a single platform. So that's what you're going to start wearing. You get the first one. So I mean, what's interesting about this kind of technology is, it's been used to guide rule changes in sports around the world. So there were too many injuries that were happening in Australian football in the last quarter of the game. And they thought that was due to the velocity of the players remaining too high in the last quarter. And if they could reduce the velocity slightly, they might reduce the number of soft tissue injuries. So they implemented a rule, which I won't go through because it's a bit arcane, but it has to do with substitutions. They measured that using this technology over the course of a year. So what's happening with player velocities and other movements, and then tracking the soft tissue injury frequency. And what they found is there was a direct correlation between the reduction in velocity in the last quarter, so it worked, players were running a little slower in the last quarter, and the number of soft tissue injuries also diminished in proportion to that drop in speed.
So that was a change in
rules. So there was a slight change to the rules that resulted in a change in injury, and that is based around this technology. So I didn't directly answer the concussion question, but I think it's a broader question than just, do you measure concussions in isolation?
Do any of you think you could measure or there would be a wearable tech that could treat concussions or deal with them?
I think we could identify concussions.
Yeah, right. I mean, we get asked that a lot because, our product focuses its energy on the brain. Yeah. But, I think the best thing for concussions is to prevent them from even happening. And if it's that using data to model the game, to change the rules of the game, or if it's about addressing it from an equipment standpoint, that's the way we should do it. That's the way we should help the players. Now, if they are concussed, could a neurostimulator help them get back on the field? That's a medical question. We're certainly interested in that, and I think there's a proper there's a proper pathway for us to look at that. But that is a serious clinical trial. Yeah.
A lot of great questions here. So I don't know if anyone wanted to jump in on some others. This one's obviously for Coach. During the final moments of a close final game, would you pull a player due to potential injury reported by wearable stats? Hypothetical, of course.
What game was it?
It was a very important game. It was the finals.
Well, there's certain decisions, like concussions. I mean, you think volleyball, but it does happen. The ball can ricochet off a block. We just had a player this week in practice that it's more prevalent than we wish. And those are decisions that I have no say in. They take the coaches, and rightly so. So that is our medical staff who makes that decision. And it's probably a good thing that I don't.
Right. Because
I'd want to win.
Yeah, you want to win. I hear you.
But we want to keep her healthy too.
I mean, Coach Kerr at the Warriors
right?
specifically said that mid-season he rested a number of his key players for a few games and took a lot of heat for that mid-season last season because of the data that was coming out of Catapult and some other technologies, and that was why they were fresh for the finals. So certainly, would he rest them in, the final game of a tied series in the finals? Probably not, but these decisions are mostly made earlier in the season in order to peak at the right time in the season.
So the Warriors' success was due to Catapult?
Well, I wouldn't say that. You need
kidding.
to speak to Coach Kerr.
Right. How about this one here?
I'd like
this is for Steve, I think, but this is applicable to a lot of people. When will wearables have more accurate data, longer battery life, and better security?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the good news is that from where they were even just a few years ago, they've made great strides. I mean, if you look at 5 years ago, a smartwatch was looked more like a phone attached to your wrist, and today they're much more closer to the size of a regular watch. And battery life is slowly advancing. I'd have to say that the ability to make good use of that battery is actually getting progressing much more rapidly. So at Intel, we're making every couple of years we make a more efficient chip that actually sips that battery life a little more carefully. And then from security, I think actually there is just now starting to be a real awareness of the value of the data and also the risk that comes with it. So there is a lot of efforts inside Intel and a lot of other big tech companies to ensure that that data is secure from the silicon all the way through the transport mechanism, whether that's a cloud or a phone or directly to the cloud, and then in the cloud itself. But I think this is one of the things where today wearables are just starting to be used in applications where that security is really critical. If someone knows my number of steps, maybe that's slightly disconcerting to me, but if they know my credit card number or can get into my car, that's a much bigger problem. So we're really taking those issues very seriously, and I think the level of security that we're getting out of wearables, especially, I think the companies that are really paying attention to it is as good as anything on your phone.
Isn't security and privacy one of the main kind of challenges to the scaling of this business? Not to put a downer on this, but couldn't some of this information sharing on wearables come up in the next collective bargaining agreement between players and leagues, and what is allowed and what is shared and who owns what?
I mean, this is what I think about the collective bargaining agreements and this kind of technology. It's so beneficial to all three parties, to players on welfare, for their welfare benefits, to teams, to the broadcasters, to the leagues. It's so beneficial to everyone. Who would want to use this as a bargaining chip in a collective bargaining agreement? So if a players' union uses it as
it can be used.
It can be, but which party should be using it? So a players' union can provide material benefit in the longevity and welfare of their players using this technology. A team can win more games. A league and broadcasters can get more interesting fan engagement. Who would possibly want to use this as a bargaining chip in these kind of negotiations? I think that would be a big mistake to use this type of information as a bargaining chip.
I would just counter that idea by saying if the League X makes a deal with Catapult, if I'm the Players Association for League X, I would want to be involved in that decision.
So we absolutely agree with that, and that's been our approach. And touch wood, the relationships that we have around the relationships we have around the world with leagues and with player unions and with teams and with players have all been very strong. And certainly, we have tried to demonstrate that we're an honest broker in this process, and we have a vested interest in every one of those parties being supportive. I just say it time and time again. All of this starts with player health and safety, and then the media layer is laid on top of that player health and safety and team tactical, and that means the Players Association needs to be supportive. That's our attitude to this.
Yeah, I think it would definitely come up in the new CBA. I think even the last one, we might have just missed that being an issue. Because early on, even with the wearables that we wear, people weren't being told the information that was gathered on the wearables. And early on, a lot of people took them off because we were told that we weren't allowed to see them. And on top of that, it was like, well, how can you track what we're doing and not tell us what the information says? So I think that is definitely going to come up in the next CBA. Also, exactly what information is made privy to the public. Not everybody wants you to know how slow you are. Not everybody wants that information out there because it could hurt your brand, or if you're not as strong as everyone thinks you are as an athlete. So I think all those issues will come up. Like you said, money is also something that benefits everybody, but that also comes up in the CBA.
I noticed that.
So yeah, I think that it'll be an issue as far as who gets the data and what they do with it.
It kind of distills down to, with great power comes great responsibility, and the data has a lot of power to it.
One of you was telling me in the other room that when one player gets traded in one league somewhere, that the data gets, help me out.
So I was telling you about Australia. So, this is used by every player in the Australian Football League, across every team, in practice and in game. It's used extensively. There's a huge pool of data. There's guaranteed contracts in the AFL, which that's a nice idea, right? So basically, there's a vested interest to maximise the longevity of players. So when a player is traded, that data is viewed openly by the player. So the players are very familiar with their own data in Australia. It is viewed by the acquiring team, and That data will follow the player to the following team in order to maximize the longevity of that player as they are traded to the new team.
It follows the player.
Follows the player.
And I think that if that is the goal of everybody, that would be incredible, to maximize the longevity of every player. If every league player, if that was everyone's goal, it'd be incredible. But, being an NFL player and being a realist, it would also follow the player, but it would follow the player more along the lines of how many miles do you have on them? And even when we talked about earlier about them, how long till high school players start implementing the wearable tech? Well, it's going to be soon, and what you're going to have is you're going to have running backs like Todd Gurley, who is an incredible running back, but you're going to have his exact mileage literally from high school to college to the NFL, to where every game is tracked, every practice is tracked, and it's going to affect where someone's drafted, where someone's signed, based on the amount of workload they've had over the last 8 years of their life.
So you're saying not all positively impacting?
Positive or negative, however you want to look.
Right.
It depends on what side of the fence you're sitting on.
Right.
But it's information that's going to be out there and it's going to be used.
Absolutely. Here's a question specifically for you. Would you license your heart rate to an NFL broadcast for the right price?
Everything has a price.
Everything has a price.
So yes, I would license a lot for the right price. But we won't get into that on this panel.
This is about wearable technology,
Wearable tech,
Andrew.
we'll keep it
Come on
wearable
now.
tech.
This is an interesting question, unless anyone wants to chime in on that.
I will license mine on this panel for the right price.
You will. Is weather data of increasing importance to wearable technology? Is weather data?
As in
The weather?
weather?
Yeah.
It's important to meteorologists, I suppose, isn't it? It's not something we're specifically heavily focused on. It would be nice to know more context around that question, and probably I could answer it better, but, it is not one of the core things that we're looking at in the next iteration of the technology. Maybe that's the way I can phrase it.
I think Amir actually used the right word there, though, which is context. I actually think that, lots of things can affect your performance and your team's performance. If it's raining one day and it's dry another, then that's going to have an effect. And so, while ideally you design all of your products to survive in any conditions, actually knowing that if there are certain environmental factors and other contextual factors that happen that relate to biometric data, just having the biometric data, that tells you the result. It doesn't tell you what caused that result. So I think actually the richer data you can have that you can actually associate with the biometric and performance data that you have, the better off you're going to be able to predict what you need to do. And maybe what you need to do is change from one pair of cleats to another. But having that data is really important.
Well, that's a good point. So we definitely see different performance and different risk of injury in wet weather scenarios versus dry weather, and we pick that up through the biometric performance data. So, we're not measuring whether it rains or not, but certainly that's a great point. So we can certainly this technology provides some guidance around footwear decisions, for example.
In different weather
Correct.
Right.
Or player performance in certain weather
That's
climates.
right.
Because we play in Cleveland, and it gets extremely cold in Cleveland. So it would be cool to have data to back up that you would be a good player in cold weather.
Cold weather player.
Yeah.
Could this help in any of that? Because this is impacting the brain or reading off the brain.
Yeah, so the brain is, and especially the motor cortex, is probably weather agnostic. It is about human performance. Whether it's raining, cold, hot, humid. The brain is sort of agnostic to that.
So, but give somebody in the audience a little bit more relevance in terms of, or in context of your science and what you're using to try to improve performance.
Yeah, so versus collecting data and having to analyze that data and connect that to performance, we are actually physically facilitating the performance of the brain. So our device provides a small electrical waveform to specifically the part of the brain that's responsible for movement. It's called the motor cortex. So if an athlete trains with this device, they stand to accelerate the neurologic gains associated with athletic training. So this is specifically part of the part of the brain that is not cognitive. So this is not around focus, concentration, calmness. This is a part of the brain that is really primarily responsible for movement. It is the last point in the brain before signals are released from the brain and interact with our muscles. So it's about skill, it's about strength, it's about accelerating those performance gains as a result from athletic training.
So I wear those and I do the skill.
Exactly. Yeah, you pair this device with athletic training. Because I think when athletes work out, and Coach, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is we're not just training the muscles, we're training the brain as much as we're training the muscles. And what is it about the brain that we're trying to make better, right? We're trying to make the brain better in terms of the refinement of the signal that is leaving the brain, so that gets at skill. We are also trying to make those signals more robust, so this gets at strength and power. So there's a neurologic basis for skill, there's a neurologic basis for strength and explosiveness. So what are we doing with this part of the athlete? Like, that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to help with.
I do think that there's a lot of, obviously a lot of focus on just physical performance, but that aspect of mental performance is important as well. That's where virtual reality training can come in, trying to help people with their reflexes. There's a product where we use strobe glasses in order to improve people's reflexes for hitting balls when they're playing baseball. I mean, I think that is another avenue of wearable technology that can be used to improve athletic performance, and it's really maybe even more in its infancy than tracking their position on the field. But it's a big opportunity, and I think especially when you think about, you can only go through so many drills before your body says you have to stop, but you'd still obviously like to sort of understand how to prepare for oncoming defense, and doing that through a virtual reality simulation may be a better way to do it than physically.
Well, I think that's a good point. Like, we're talking about, like, 90% of this conversation has been around wearables that are passive, right? They're measuring something about your body, they're sensors. Like, will we enter an era where wearables become active, right, versus passive devices? Like, neurostimulation, using VR, which is an active wearable.
How many have used VR in this room? How many have experienced virtual reality? And is there and it gets to one of these questions here, where can I find it? What kind of impact is virtual reality tech making in the wearable space, and what do you hope to see it do or monitor?
So there's one company that's very close to ours, geographically, and also the Stanford connection is Striver. So I know they're doing more things than just quarterback training, but they started with quarterback training, and Andrew, you could talk about like how difficult it is to get reps on a football field, and especially for the quarterback to really sort of immerse himself in the game and what the defense is doing, what the receivers are doing. It takes another 21 people around them to make that work, right? Like, what if we could replicate that virtually, so that it's all about getting reps that are sort of physically free, right?
Right, mentally instead of physical.
Yeah, right. I think, much like you said, I think that is kind of the new frontier is going to be in football, because what happens, that's our whole point of practice, is more probably the mental reps than anything, because physically it doesn't make sense to beat yourself into the ground all week to try to peak on Sunday, but it's kind of necessary evil because you need to get those looks. You need to put yourself in that situation and be able to see it before you get to game day. So with the virtual reality, having the opportunity to see that and not put the physical strain on your body throughout the week, I think it's only going to help grow the sport and add more value to players and teams alike.
Plus, your practice time has been curtailed in the latest CBA anyway, and so
if we can keep making it smaller, I'm all on board with that.
You're all on board with that. We got about 10 minutes left, so I want to kind of shoot through some of these questions because they're very good, and the audience has been great. It's a great question. You've talked about player protection on wearables, CBAs, and unions. Who would protect college and high school athletes when it comes to wearable data technology or wearable technology data? It's a good question.
Who protects them now?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good, not necessarily a question, but it is a good point in terms of if that data is out there. It seems that the fears are surrounding coaches misusing data. If data of wearables was treated as medical information, wouldn't this solve the issue?
It is semi-treated as medical information, so we need HIPAA compliance in order to do what we do. It is treated in very similar ways. The data security, is taken as seriously as that type of medical information would be. It's not quite there, and one great example is the lack of access that a lot of athletes get to the information means it's not treated exactly the way that personal medical records are treated in this country. But I think, if you want to talk about the kind of bargaining that might occur in a CBA that I might think is sensible conversation, it would be around more access by players for this type of information so that they are more aware of how they can help themselves improve and be healthier. That, to me, is the right kind of conversation to be having.
But Coach, you wouldn't want all that information out of you'd want to see that information. You just wouldn't want to treat it as medical information.
Well, the thing you were talking about earlier about the data and what you do with it, if you could just go off numbers, recruiting for track and swimming would be the easiest ever. There's so many other variables. We're talking about 18-year-olds and all that. And so, yes, the information is valuable. The hard data is so valuable, but it's coached in the gray. The game is played in the gray, coaching is in the gray, and so having that information, working with our medical staff in collaboration, I think is the key.
But I think that the distinction between performance data and medical data, those lines are really blurring, right? Because what's your performance data up to one point is your hamstring recovery at the next moment. So having those two as sort of separate pillars of data doesn't make a ton of sense. They really should be blended together, but then obviously you need to follow the same kind of guidelines around HIPAA compliance and being sure that data is accessed in a responsible way.
For consumers, I know the big issue, Steve, has been a lot of these wearables are not fashion forward. They are, right? I mean, they're either too clunky, they don't look. How have you been able to try to address that to make them more fashionably oriented?
I mean, that's been a big effort within Intel. Obviously we partner with a lot of different brands. We partner with Oakley, we're partnering with New Balance, we're partnering with Tag Heuer. We brought out a very successful smartwatch. And part of the reason why we partner with somebody like Tag Heuer, or Opening Ceremony, which is another fashion brand, is that they do understand what people want to wear, and they bring that understanding and aesthetic that maybe we as a Silicon Valley tech giant don't really have in terms of what is it that's going to make people comfortable wearing these devices and give them not just the value of the technology, but I think we all want to wear things that make us feel good about ourselves and that we want people to appreciate. So
give the audience a glimpse into the next 12, 24 months. What's one maybe consumer wearable tech that you're excited about that you think is kind of cool?
Well, there's actually a lot of them. I mean, I think that's, selfishly, I really like some of the things we're doing inside Intel, like the Radar Pace that we're doing with Oakley. It looks like a regular pair of glasses, but it brings this whole dimension of real-time coaching to you while you're working out, running, or cycling.
So what would you see? I'm sorry, just be like, so if I'm wearing those, what would I see?
Well, you wear them like a regular pair of glasses, but there's actually a in-ear coach, audible coach, that's tracking your performance and then actually telling you, how to improve your run or your cycling actually in the workout. So it's not really just capturing historical data. It's actually looking at what you're doing in the moment and giving you advice on kind of what to do next, so you don't overtrain, you don't actually injure yourself, you actually get the full value of the workout. And then, that's built around a coaching routine that is customized for you and your body's response.
Gotcha.
People ask us about wearables for consumers a lot because they say you've got these 800 or 900 elite teams. It's a great halo effect. Let's leverage that down at the consumer level. And so we think about sports performance wearables down at the consumer level. And so the distinction that I would make, what do I think is, because they haven't cracked it, right? There's still not very large uptake of these type of wearables yet. And so we look at wearables today, let's call them activity trackers predominantly. And to me, they look like a great solution that is in search of a problem to solve effectively, right? They provide some really interesting information, and then after 6 months, you realize you don't really need a lot of that information. And I haven't heard of people buying 2 of them before. And so probably the next phase of real consumer wearables at the performance level will be identifying the real problems that need to be solved for amateur athletes and to create data and analytics that simply solve those problems and give them guidance on what they should be doing. And in team sports, that will heavily be around identification of events or skills and understanding how well those skills have been executed. And maybe in an ideal world, Hawk will charge us just a small amount of money to license some of his performance data. So negotiations have started. And we'll be able to let some players compare themselves to some pro athletes and their performance. So I think that's probably the future of consumer wearables.
And so there was a question here about what's next for Catapult or some of these companies, smaller hardware, better analytics. What's the next step?
Well, I just showed you smaller hardware and better analytics. Give me a break. We just launched that like 2 days ago. It's a tough crowd.
Tough crowd, man.
I think that probably the majority of our focus will be 70% on continuing to enhance analytics towards predictive analytics. And the hardware, whilst it's still important, the analytics software analytics is taking much more of a central role now for our business.
Okay, so we've got less than 5 minutes, so we'll start to finish up here. If we have this session in 2 years, in March of 2018, if I'm doing my math right, where are we? What are we looking at? How much more advanced is this conversation?
Well, every single pro and elite team in the US is wearing wearables in practice and in game, and every league is supporting it, and the data is reaching the fans in an engaging way to tell stories. I mean, that will be a very sad situation if that is not the case in 2 years' time. And my prediction is that will be the case. I don't know what the global penetration of this will be, but it won't be 10%. Maybe it will be. I can't say what it will be because then people will say I'm giving forecasts as a public company. But more than 10%. And I think there'll be some kind of consumer wearable that takes advantage of what has been learnt at the elite level. I think that will all happen within the next 2 years.
And if everybody, just so real quick on a follow-up, if everybody has that data, if everybody has that wearable, does the competition change? Does it become better? Does it?
Well, I think players get less injured. The games get more interesting and better players are playing. I think it'll deliver much better fan engagement because they will understand the game. It's become very complicated. The tactics are very complicated in pro sport today. Fans will better understand the tactics that are going on, and that deeper immersion in the game results in a better fan experience, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I hope that we'll see. One is that the data will not be siloed, right? That we will see the integration of data into hubs that provide the proper amount of contextualization so that we can take a lot of the subjectivity out of the contextualization. Two, I would hope to see that there are more active wearables versus passive wearables. That hopefully Halo is one of the first, and we'll see a longer list of these types of devices coming out. I guess there was an appropriate point made earlier, and that is data for data's sake. There's the conundrum of multiplicity. If you continuously just capture data, you need to be able to reinforce that with a connection to real value. And also that data should be non-obvious, right? It should offer a clear connection to value, non-obvious, and actionable. To the extent that data sort of satisfies those 3 criteria, I think it's going to have a great impact on this conference and sports broadly. And I guess the last thing is a personal thing, and this is really as a fan engagement type of tool, is I hope we begin to appreciate the game through metrics that actually matter, that actually describe the game in a way that is more true to life. I hope we get rid of batting average, for example. That is a statistic that is purely historical. It has nothing to do has very little to do with the player and their true value to the game.
Ambitious in 2 years, Daniel, I will say. That's
right.
Good. That's good.
I think along the lines of what he said, as far as, there's going to be more wearables that keep coming, and there's so much data, and sometimes it seems like it's data for data's sake. I think it's going to create an entire new talent pool. Maybe a lot of people sitting here in this audience that are going to be able to see which data is relevant, translate it, and make it applicable. You know what I mean? So as quarterbacks, we can coach quarterbacks until we're blue in the face, but we can't create Peyton Manning. You can't coach a Tom Brady. Those guys have a special talent that they've honed over years of playing football, and I think this will be the same way. You'll have people that are more talented than others in these professional organizations that are able to see this data and configure it in a way that adds value to their team and gives them a distinct advantage over everybody else.
Steve?
Yeah, I think you guys have really captured the points around data really well, and the importance of actually getting the right insights and the right analytics around them. I mean, when I think about the hardware of wearables, I sort of hope we're talking about software in terms of soft wearables as opposed to hardware. We're actually moving more towards things that feel more natural to wear and aren't just a little nugget of technology attached to somebody's shirt. I also actually am excited about the idea of wearables that don't just measure your performance, but actually enhance your performance, and the idea that they can change, your shoes can change, how much they absorb, shock they absorb, depending upon how you're running or what your performance is, or maybe pads that actually adjust so they're not restrictive, but at the same time they, are able to change their characteristics if you're hit so that they protect you more effectively. So I think that idea of, and we've played around a little bit with it with our collaborations with Chromat, but the idea of clothing that actually adapts to you and enhances your performance is something I think hopefully we'll see in the next couple of years here.
And Coach, you get the last word.
I think the last piece might be fan engagement. Maybe it's not an issue for the NFL, but if SEC college stadiums, football stadiums are not filling because you have a better experience sitting on your living room couch watching HD, that's an issue. And so what can wearable technology do for the fans in the arena? I think there's a huge market for that.
I agree with you. Great panel, great audience, great questions. They're going to be around. Thank you very much.